Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, whose theme is Unlocking Finance to Deliver on the Promise of the Post-Malabo Agenda. This webinar is organized by the Zero Hunger Coalition and its partners as part of the Road to Kampala initiative, which aims to stimulate critical and action-oriented discussions with key actors and experts to ensure that the transformation of Africa's agri-food systems remains a top global development priority. My name is Jérémy Lissouba, Member of Parliament from the Republic of Congo, that's Congo-Brazzaville, and Secretary General for the African Food Systems Parliamentary Network. I have the great honor of facilitating our conversation today. Coming up is a very exciting and deeply relevant conversation about what I'm sure we would all agree is one of the biggest challenges we face in our common quest to deliver sustainable development in our lifetimes. To be sure, we are today talking about investments and financing, le nerf de la guerre, as the Francophones would say. As you know, the African Union will, in just over 1 month, convene an extraordinary summit of heads of state and government in Kampala, Uganda, to debate and approve the strategy and action plan for the third phase of the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Programme, better known as CAADP. This third phase, or CAADP 3 as we will call it, represents an ambitious vision to transform Africa's agri-food systems, addressing food insecurity and malnutrition, enhancing climate resilience, and fostering inclusive and sustainable economic growth. However, achieving this ambition requires a scale of investment that matches its scope and far beyond what we have managed to mobilize for this purpose to this day. And therein lies the challenge. Africa's fiscal environment today is deeply constrained. The continent's debt crisis, stemming from high borrowing levels, unfavorable terms, and systemic inequities within the global financial system, means that many countries are grappling with debt distress, further limiting the fiscal space needed to invest in transformative agricultural and food systems initiatives. At the same time, shifting global donor priorities and the escalating impacts of climate change are adding further layers of complexity. According to recent studies, the investment gap for ending hunger by 2030 is estimated between $93 and $512 billion annually. And this may require investments of up to 40% of least developed country GDP in order to transform Africa's agri-food systems to deliver on their full potential. So as you can see, these figures are staggering and compel us to ask, how can African countries mobilize the necessary resources to address these challenges whilst ensuring long-term sustainability? With traditional financing models falling short, what bold shifts in strategy and structure are needed to unlock sustainable funding for Africa's agri-food systems? What barriers must be overcome, and how can financing instruments be effectively designed to scale investments and bridge financing gaps for maximum impact? Daunting as this may seem, there is nevertheless hope and opportunity to be found. The potential for domestic resource mobilization remains largely untapped in many contexts, both in terms of volume and potential efficiency gains. Moreover, innovative financing mechanisms, including blended finance models, public-private partnerships, climate finance, and debt for development swaps, offer promising solutions, as these tried and tested approaches, when effectively structured, can have significant potential for transformative impact. This discussion is incredibly timely. A few weeks ago, the G20 met in Brazil, where the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty was launched, with the aim of providing a nexus between knowledge, policies, and finance, as well as securing financial commitments from a range of development partners. We also know that the $300 billion annual pledge secured at COP29 did not meet the expectations of much of the development community, forcing us to look beyond in our quest to secure levels of financing we know are needed to effectively address the many crises we face. This week, partners will meet in Seoul, South Korea, for the World Bank's IDA 21 final replenishment meeting to secure pledges for this important concessional loan mechanism that so many of our countries rely on. And next year will be the turn of the African Development Bank to do the same. So in sum, whilst focused primarily on Africa, this conversation today is truly part of a global conversation. Our distinguished panelists bring deep expertise and practical insights on innovative financing mechanisms, policy reforms, and investment strategies that can help close the financing gap whilst navigating Africa's complex fiscal landscape. We will begin with a roundtable discussion featuring our esteemed panelists, each offering unique perspectives on the challenges and opportunities in financing CAADP 3. Audience participation is encouraged throughout, so please share your questions in the chat and we will address them during the Q&A segment that will follow the panel discussion. Finally, we will conclude with key takeaways and a look at the next steps on this important journey. On behalf of the Zero Hunger Coalition, I thank you all for joining us today. And as we begin, I invite you to reflect on one central question. What will it take to move decisively from ambition to impact? Let's get started. So my first question will be for Akif Merchant. Akif Merchant is Director for Engagement and Capacity Building and Head of Africa Division at Convergence, which is a global network of institutions, organizations, and businesses dedicated to promoting blended finance, namely to advance the SDGs and Paris Agreement. So, Akif, good morning, or good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, there is much talk in development circles today about blended finance, which relates to using public money to de-risk and attract private money to boost investments in various sectors. In recent years, we've seen positive trends in blended finance in the agri-food sector in Africa, which is also true with regards to climate finance. According to studies published by your organization, the value and the number of blended financing deals that have closed in Africa since the end of COVID-19 have both increased, primarily driven by financing for climate-smart agriculture and agri-food businesses, namely related to agricultural inputs. So my first question to you, Akif, is could you tell us more about what has triggered this increase? And would you say that foreign investors are generally getting more comfortable with the risks, be they legal, political, commercial, or even operational, as these are typically perceived with regards to investing in these sectors in Africa?
Very well. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you to the Zero Hunger Coalition for having me here today. And also you, Honorable Asuba, for your leadership on this important issue on this topic. Convergence is the global network for blended finance. We track and we maintain data on blended finance deals across the global south. If we look at Africa, we have around half of our deals that are Africa focused and African orientation. We have around 1,200 deals in total in aggregate that we're tracking. 25% of those are agricultural deals, whether that's agri-inputs, agri-processing, or agri-finance. Now, these could be sort of three classes of deals as well. These could be direct deals. So think, for example, Hello Tractor, a pay-as-you-go tractor financing facility as an example, which is blended. Or think of Aseli Africa, a concessional facility that mobilizes capital from the various different ODA donors and then supports and facilitates and nudges banks through first loss portfolio guarantees and origination incentives to get them to lend more to the agri-economy. Or think of classic fund structures like the Cla Mondiale Food Securities Fund, which provides working capital loans to agriculture aggregators. So that's sort of the setting around which you have blended finance. Now, inherent in the definition of blended finance is having this concessional capital to mobilize, to catalyze, and to de-risk the private sector. As you can imagine, this concessional capital is exceedingly scarce. Official donor budgets are stretched, and of course, African balance sheets, African government balance sheets are stretched as well. Having said that, the momentum around climate finance is really an accelerant or a driver for more agricultural deals. Climate in this context is a cross-cutting theme, is a cross-cutting topic, and climate-smart agriculture, adaptation finance are some of the sort of sub-sectors within the climate ecosystem. So as a lot of concessional money or official development money gets reallocated or redirected towards climate finance. That is showing up in agricultural deals, and that is being used to mobilize private capital that's sitting on the sidelines to get agri deals off the ground. Now, I don't necessarily think that commercial investors, or even, as you said, foreign investors, are getting more comfortable with the risks in Africa. In fact, over the last couple of years, we've seen interest rates rise around the world. They are coming down, but rise around the world, and so your country risk premiums have been increasing. The biggest challenges that investors face that I speak to, number one is foreign exchange risk. Huge problem. Foreign exchange risk is a massive problem in the space. Also, deal sizes. The kinds of foreign investors that we should be looking to get off the sidelines, that we should be looking to mobilize into these transactions, tend to prefer large ticket sizes. We can spend all day in the Central African Republic or Burkina Faso, and we'll not find large transactions in this particular space. Then, of course, you have country risk. There's only 2 or 3 African countries that have an investment grade rating, so that automatically precludes investment from flowing. And then, of course, you have underlying credit risk as a function of political risk and so on and so forth. So what we are seeing is various different blended transactions that are saying, you know what, let's have an aggregation approach. Let's bundle together many transactions from Kenya, from South Africa, from Malawi, from Senegal, from Morocco. So we can diversify for geography, we can diversify across currencies, and we can also mitigate around the lack of the large deal sizes. And in those transactions, if we can add in some blending elements, so portfolio first loss, or if we have a guarantee wrap or technical assistance as well, that is allowing these transactions to essentially credit enhance themselves, so that now we've got transactions that might be small, that might have an underlying credit profile of double B or single B. But essentially what we've created is we've created an investable asset that these commercial investors or these foreign investors can invest in. So creative structuring and official development in the lens of climate finance, which is agri as a subset, is really what's driving investors to consider agriculture as a potential asset class across the continent. So it's been quite promising. We've got a lot of work to do, and I'm looking forward to unpacking some of this as we go along this conversation.
Thank you so much, Akif, for these brilliant insights. And certainly it was perhaps hopeful of us to imagine that the perception of risk was coming down, or that investors were feeling more comfortable. But it's very encouraging to hear that your approach is working. The approach essentially of aggregating and essentially hedging against those risks in that way. And I see how that's enabled you to do more. I'll come back to you shortly to know more about the way some of these deals are structured and some of these arrangements are structured. But first, I would like to turn to Jason Braganza. So Jason Braganza is Executive Director of the African Forum and Network on Debt Development, under the acronym AFRODAD, which I believe is probably the best acronym we have in the development community. But Jason, I wanted to turn to you because there is a sense in which when we listen to Akif, the idea of a conducive environment really, it's something that we've talked about for a very long time, particularly when it comes to private sector investments within the countries. And clearly it is critical to attracting the kinds of investments we need for agri-food systems transformation. I wanted to turn to you and particularly focus on an aspect of the question which you'll be very familiar with because your organization has a long history of work in this respect, which is the question of debt. We know that one of the key deterrents to creating this conducive environment is that many African countries have fragile public finances and high levels of public debt. We also know that important conversations, particularly at the G20 a few weeks ago, aimed to draw more support for the likes of the debt service suspension initiatives, investing for debt arrangements, and changing the way development finance institutions can take on more of the risks inherent to investing in developing countries. So first of all, Jason, I want to know if you had to highlight 2 of the most promising developments in recent years in this regards, what would they be? And more generally, to what extent do you foresee levels of indebtedness remain such significant impediments to attracting investments moving forward? And I say this very mindful of the fact that currently a lot of African countries are falling back into debt crises. So how significant is the problem, and how promising are some of the solutions we are seeing today?
Thank you very much to the Zero Hunger Coalition for inviting Afrodat to be part of this. And I think the question you've asked is extremely pertinent given the situation. Just contextually, this is sort of what we're looking at. Close to half of the continent is spending more in debt service interest repayments than it is in public investments, in health, in education, and so on. And essentially, what is currently happening in many countries on the continent is that investments in things like agriculture, in food sovereignty, food production systems, are being crowded out because governments are being forced to divert quite a bit of resource towards servicing debt and keeping their sort of credit ratings and creditors extremely happy so that they can then continue to leverage international capital markets. And so we find ourselves in this very bizarre, vicious cycle where a debt crisis that should be managed in a more progressive, more democratic, and more inclusive way is actually continuing to be another pressure point for the inability of countries to leverage resources, the inabilities of countries to actually make very careful and strategic decisions about where they should be investing and where they should be allocating critical resources at this moment in time. I think the second point that is extremely important in this conversation is, to what extent are our governments, as a result of these crises, sort of giving up or surrendering their ability to take control of their own food sovereignty, their own food production systems, and therefore it's sort of outsourcing it to market, to private sector. And particularly here, we need to distinguish, and I like the point that Akif made here, is we need to distinguish between which private sector we're defining, right? Is it African private sector, indigenous African food producers, or are we sort of outsourcing this to global multinational corporation, big food corporations outside? And I think the point there then becomes the extent to which you go down the path of wanting to de-risk foreign multinational capital at the expense of many other things, right? So it's not just to attract the investment. When you are doing de-risking, you're also, on the other hand, trading off potential tax revenues. You're trading off potential and increasing potential tax expenditures, again, which contribute to the fiscal deficit that countries have, which then sort of lead to the need to have to borrow. So we've got to be very careful about the definitions of whom we define as a private sector, who we define as investors in the food and agricultural sector. The third point is that we need to bring back a level of political ownership of CAADP. We need to bring back a level of sort of political pride on the continent that our African governments need to make sure that they implement and stay true to the commitments that they are making. I think the notion that our governments can continue to sign and agree to these different types of commitments but not follow through is extremely problematic, and it does then give rise to these kinds of challenges where then we are forced to sort of outsource our own food production sovereignty to the external sector and predominantly outside of the continent. My fourth and final point around what you're asking around debt and how countries are therefore now looking at different types of debt instruments. I think this is very symptomatic of how short-sighted and short-termism the policy responses are tending to be right now. Things like debt swaps, things like food bonds, and so on, really take away the ability of countries to look at, the production side of things in a very structural and systemic way, but also, again, continue the idea of outsourcing the production mechanism of our food and agricultural processing outside and extra to the continent. And I think this comes with lots of problems and lots of challenges. And so, in terms of bright spots that we need to look at, I really think that it needs to come down to greater political will and political commitment to reversing this trend of outsourcing our food production, our agricultural capacity. Because I think it is a mainstay of very many countries' foreign exchange sources. If you look across the continent, the country where I come from in Kenya, agriculture still remains one of the biggest sources of foreign exchange. Yet, as a sector, it has found itself being defunded and deinvested in over the last decade, and the sector as a whole, is actually shrinking. But yet it is still considered to be a major source of foreign exchange. And so I do think there's a need for us to rethink and relook at how the political commitment to some of these apportioning of resources and revenues to investment in the continent by indigenous African businesses, indigenous African food producers needs to be looked at. And linked to this is the policy direction away from cash crop export-oriented production. And I think this orientation is extremely important as well from a policy side of things. We have been sort of shepherded towards focusing on cash cropping as opposed to food cropping and subsistence domestic food production cropping. And I think this is also leading and contributing to the vulnerabilities that we are facing. And again, with the sort of interventions that Akif has made, giving rise to this increased need to externalize food crop production or food crop imports onto the continent, because we're sort of producing what we don't consume and consuming what we don't produce. From a food perspective, and that has huge implications on food sovereignty issues. It has huge implications to how we deal with the very systemic and existential threat of climate change as well, and things like that. So I do think that the bright spots would be around reorienting our political commitment towards CAADP and reorienting our food production system away from predominantly being cash cropping to more food cropping on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for this very thought-provoking intervention. I mean, really what I'm hearing from you is you are calling on a very profound, systemic redesign of our food systems, because you point out some very important ways in which the way things are happening is certainly not sustainable and might even be more damaging than it seems. I mean, you raise the fact that today states are starting to pay more to service their debt than they are investing in sectors like education and healthcare. You mentioned the fact that whilst agricultural sectors continue to be a very important sort of foreign exchange currencies, you also recognize the underinvestment, and you are speaking my language as a policymaker, because we've seen the struggle that it's represented to reach the 10% of national budgets allocated to agriculture. So really your message resonates. And finally, a very important takeaway is the question of political will. We've spoken about this so often. It's true that we need more accountability for the commitments that some of our member states make, because yes, it's true. Beyond the signing of the declaration, there seems to be a loss of ownership at the national level. And this is something we as parliamentarians focused and engaged in this space have noticed. So thank you so much for that, Jason. And I'd like to stick with you for 1 second. How do you believe we should approach If you agree with this, the way that I've summarized it, in the sense that you are calling for quite a fundamental systemic transformation of our food systems and in the way we think about our food systems. I very much like also what you mentioned about sovereignty and about finding solutions or developing, addressing domestic needs, essentially, rather than seeking to cater to markets beyond our borders. My question is, to what extent do you feel the environment and the ingredients for that are present today? I particularly want to get your take on questions of accountability and transparency, because they are critical to bringing in the right sort of voices and changing certain behaviors. But to what extent do you see that those conditions are present currently to enable the kind of transformation you are talking about?
I think they are present, both socially and politically. If you look at the, for example, what happened in with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as soon as we had the invasion of Ukraine, grain imports to the continent pretty much, declined very drastically. And immediately, you had a massive outcry from the African Union about how this was going to affect food production, how it was going to affect food distribution. And I think, politically, it is very ripe for the continent to be alert that in a highly globalized world and a highly globalized economy, that Africa as a continent is no longer immune from global shocks. And therefore, there needs to be a very dramatic political decision to bring back onto the continent certain dimensions of our productive capacity. We no longer have the luxury of exporting that out to the rest of the world and becoming or remaining as net importers of basic things like food, like grain, and so on and so forth. I think the second catalyst that we've seen in 2024 and maybe towards the end of 2023 is the social dimension, the social unrest that has emanated from the debt crisis, from different types of lack of legitimacy in political leadership, but more importantly, the rise in the cost of living, and particularly the rise of food prices on the continent. We've seen huge public unrest, social unrest across the continent in this regard. And so the conditions, both politically and socially, are really prime. We're seeing governments changing left, right, and center. In Southern Africa, we've seen, things we never thought we would be seeing, established governments having to enter into coalitions. We're seeing in West Africa potential changes in government coming up, in Ghana. We saw this in Senegal. In Kenya, we saw the protests. In Uganda, we've seen the protests. So you can see that there is a wave of social discontent with the way society, the way citizens are feeling the strain of high cost of living, the high burden of debt, the regressive nature of taxation, which puts pressure on things like basic commodities like food. And so, the opportunity for government and governments across the continent is to rethink the extent to which they can reorient production, particularly of food. I think there's many Pan-Africanists, many thinkers and academics who've always mentioned that, if to keep the peace, you need to have food within your borders. A lot of people have said that, and the inability of our region and of our government at the moment to have food on the table, irrespective of the income spectrum that people emerge from, is going to be a definite determinant on the social cohesion that exists on the continent. So there is a huge opportunity there. And again, because it is a significant source of labor employment, it's a source of revenue, there are ways in which, governments can invest in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And absolutely, I think we all remember, the food price crises of 2007, 2008. And I think we've seen how, a lot of the social unrest sort of finds its source in issues related to food. And of course, as you say, our agricultural sectors, particularly on the continent, are so closely tied to the livelihoods of so many of our people that these shifts resonate throughout society. And you also mentioned a lot of the social unrest that we've seen throughout the continent in recent times. Of course, we know the impact of the Ukraine war. We know the impact of COVID-19 also, and how inflation has spread across the world, and the effect that is having. I'd like to turn to Lebogang Ramafoko. Lebogang, who is Executive Director of Oxfam South Africa, because Lebogang, Oxfam obviously is an organization that needs no introduction, and you work a lot on questions of equity and inclusion. And the way I bounce from what Jason was saying is that, yes, we're seeing a lot of, we're seeing that civil society is demanding a lot of these changes within the countries, as opposed to necessarily governments wising up to it. Governments are notoriously slow, we know this. And I wonder if you could tell us more about where you see the role of civil society in this. Do you find that today there is sufficient transparency for civil society to really grasp the issues and also access the kinds of decision-making circles that are going to make some of these changes possible? And more generally, how do you see the mechanisms that promote equity and inclusion when it comes to financing and this decision-making, access to resources, particularly for marginalized groups, particularly also for small-scale food producers who tend to be, in fact, I was recently told that the majority of Hungary on the continent are food producers, and that echoes some of the deep contradictions that Jason was talking about. So, essentially, my question is this, Lebogang: given Oxfam's long tradition of work on questions of equity and inclusion, what are some of the ways in which civil society is getting involved in these conversations, and how can their voices be further amplified to ensure that community-led solutions are prioritized in respect to financing and more generally in respect to agri-food systems transformation? And also, if you could also answer this following question: how is Oxfam South Africa specifically seeking to disrupt the more traditional top-down models of financing that we have to drive investments that directly address the needs of those marginalized groups, small-scale producers, women and youth? Thank you, Lebogang.
Yes, thank you so much, Honorable Lesuba, Zero Hunger Coalition, for inviting us to this very important conversation. And I really want to start where Jason left off, because I think when you look at the impact of COVID-19, the war in the Russia-Ukraine war, and climate change and its impact, particularly in Africa, which is only responsible for 3% of emissions, you will realize that, we cannot be engaged in business as usual. But I think some of these issues that we speak about, particularly at global platforms, at regional platforms, sometimes tend to forget that ultimately these are about people. And what we are seeing, even in a country like South Africa and elsewhere in South Africa, is that a number of these conflicts, a number of this instability causes displacement. And what you are seeing is that you are not only seeing big political uprisings, as we have witnessed in many other countries, but you are also seeing unprecedented conflict within countries, as witnessed in South Africa, especially in what is termed as xenophobic attacks or Afrophobia, which essentially is about the poor, who are mainly Black, both South African and from other parts of Africa, fighting for very limited resources, and the displacement and the influx into South Africa being caused by some of the instability that is caused by the many other problems that we are talking about, and the reversal of some of the gains that Africa had made in terms of economic growth as a result of the problems that we see. So what is the role of civil society in all of this? I think first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that the role of government is to serve people. And the role of civil society, therefore, and civil society organizations is to speak out when this does not happen. We are also working in an environment where if civil society organizations do not build the knowledge capacity of communities and movements really do not have space to operate. We are also having another a big problem, which is a ticking bomb of disinformation, where, like I said earlier on, people then turn on each other when they are trying to understand why they are hungry. So part of what civil society does is to really resource and to build movements that really understand some of the issues that, or some of the factors that drive issues such as hunger. And we have worked with many partners like the Climate Action Network that has chapters across the world to make sure that even with climate justice and climate financing, communities understand what their demand can be. What I also want to say is the fact that civil society needs particular conducive environments to work. And we note with concern as Oxfam that in many environments, they are met with repression. And if we understand that a number of the issues that are causing instability in our countries are really macro issues. Issues of debt are macro issues. And so when people take to the street, perhaps what we are missing, particularly with shrinking civil spaces, is an ability to engage and understand what are the changes that civil society wants to advocate for. And therefore, organizations like Oxfam play a vital role in ensuring that it brings the voices of the most marginalized at the seat, especially at decision-making seats. And I know that our colleagues in Oxfam in Africa have also made submissions to CADEP to make sure that it adopts a gender responsive budgeting, because the issues of hunger, as you rightfully said, affects smallholder farming, who are mainly comprised of young people and youth. And yet we send government delegations to go to forums like COP29, where we saw how disappointing it is, you know, for countries who really do not want to finance just transition or put forward the $5 trillion that are required in order to reverse the devastations of climate change and the instability that they bring. But in particular, what Oxfam also does, and it has done well over the years, to produce reports. These reports are very important because first and foremost, our inequality reports really begin to paint the picture as it stands in affecting or in how these issues affect those that are mostly at risk. Very recently, we basically published a report, which was October 2024, on commitment to reduce inequality, which shows the link between the countries that are at the bottom 10 countries who are either at the risk or are already in debt crisis. And these reports are very important because they actually make sure that we do not leave the impact of people on the ground. But we don't only advocate as Oxfam, and particularly in South Africa. What we have done is to really make sure that we participate in South Africa's Agriculture Agro-Processing Master Plan, and which is part of the South African National Development Plan, which emphasizes empowering small holder farmers and supports climate resilient initiatives at the local and national level. And what we have done is to establish a gender working group, which is engaged in policy dialogue to ensure a feminist lens anchored on gender sensitivity to make sure that issues that affect women are taken into consideration. We've also launched a leadership development fellowship, a feminist fellowship, because a number of organizations need ongoing capacity to understand both economically, because some of these conversations that take place, including climate conversations, in such abstract terms that while communities, and particularly smallholder farmers and informal traders, can see how their income is affected, they can see how their crops are affected, they are really not plugged into some of the very abstract and policy conversations. So part of what is important is to demystify and deconstruct policy conversations such that a woman who is sitting in a rural area who is facing a loss of crops because of climate change can understand how that links to issues and conversations around debt, and can have a conversation. Very recently, again, I think it was around September, Women on Farms, which comprises of farm workers in South Africa, marched on the government of Germany to advocate for the banning of 67 pesticides that are banned by the EU and are not used in EU countries, but continue to be exported to Africa and are causing a lot of damage. Very recently in South Africa, we have seen the death of many children, and the link to the deaths of children who buy from informal shops is these pesticides that are really not controlled. So the ability of linking real life experiences has two advantages. One, it enables communities to really understand rather than relying on sometimes far-right fueled disinformation, to understand the root causes, but also to demand a seat on the at the decision-making table. But it also helps governments to learn how we can adapt some of the policies that we have to be very responsive to the people that we need. For an example, we are talking about the loss and damage fund around climate justice. And if you are not going to be speaking about how the loss and damage fund is going to reach women who are probably most marginalized in Africa, and if you leave it to decision makers, to policy makers, to lawmakers to design mechanisms, you do know that 5-10 years down the line, you are going to find that there was a fund. The money financing part of it may have been won, but not. So in conclusion, we need to see the work that happens at policy work being incomplete if we don't pair it with real work at community level. And if we also do not treat research as extractive, only to get the experiences of those that are most affected by the problem at hand, but we really do not bring them to the seat at the table. I think the opportunity of the G20, as we have seen with the C20 and G20 social in Brazil, happening on the continent of Africa, it's a good opportunity to bring all of these groups to the fore to speak to the finance ministers around financing some of these issues. And really the demands that we make, including demands around transparency on debt, is going to take communities through civil society and organizations to understand why these issues are important. We also have had a program where we worked with the community of Lephalale, which houses one of the biggest investment in the energy crisis that South Africa is experiencing, the Medupi power station, where there are the loans that were taken from the African Development Bank and the World Bank needed to ensure that the environment where people are living are protected. But because of a lack of transparency around these loans, they have not seen some of the commitments that have been made. We have seen how with COVID-19, those investments were made. And by empowering community organizations that are already seeing the effects of, for an example, with Medupi Power Station, in ensuring that communities can speak to financiers. And it is through projects like that where we could actually take the impact from the community members themselves, who are able, through the kind of information sharing and research sharing that we conduct with them, to basically ensure that their voices are heard. And I think lastly, for me, the main issue is the fact that government alone does not have the answers. Business is not the panacea. Finance is about people. The resources that have made even countries in the global north rich are resources that exist in many African countries, which are resources of the people. And I think as we try and find some of these solutions to the problems that we face right now, the kind of understanding that there is no one group that is going to do it alone. But most importantly, you need to ask who is most affected and bring them to the table. It's going to be key. But this partnership will also not be complete if you don't bring in research institutions. So in some of our projects, understanding the agricultural value chain, which is another area of blockage for many smallholder farmers, is to partner with research institutions, to work with communities, to work with smallholder farmers, to understand where the blockages in the value chain is. And it is amazing how, in fact, when you look at the intersectionality of issues, you will realize that the lack of recognition of care work, which is mainly performed by women and girls, has a direct impact on whether or not you can get women meaningfully involved in these dialogues. And therefore, it is not only disrupting systems, but it is also creating enabling environments by making civil spaces conducive for people to participate, by making information available, but by also creating space for civil society organizations to participate in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lebogang, for this very rich answer. Indeed, I think it's so. One of the things that struck me with your intervention is very basic, in fact, but it's something that seems to be forgotten, which is that building knowledge and capacity to understand beyond disinformation, beyond any sort of some of the conspiracy theories we hear, but really having the information to really understand what is being done, what needs to be done, how it affects a specific group of people or specific groups of people, and what can be done to redress the situation, I think is fundamental. And that, I think, is something that is often forgotten by governments, where we feel that, I say we, I'm a parliamentarian, so not quite government, but we're closely related. But we feel that oftentimes we have the expert knowledge, we know better, we see the macro picture, and therefore we feel that the answers we bring at that level are either encompass or somehow more important than the realities happening at the micro level. And I really appreciate what you said about policy work being incomplete without translating essentially to the ground and to the communities that are involved and to what actually happens in practice. So I found that really fascinating, and there's so much more to draw from your intervention. But I also appreciated what you said about how building the knowledge then enables to create the sort of collective action mechanisms that can then be mobilized to put pressure, or at least to join certain conversations. Because I think, I don't know if our participants heard this too, as I did, but it was a sense that it's not always a confrontation. You mentioned the fact that sometimes there were people trying to get specific answers or raising specific problems that were met with repression, in the sense that we refuse to have these conversations when, in fact, having these conversations can actually bring consensual solutions. So thank you so much for this this enriching conversation. I mean, there's so much more to say about it, but that perspective was very important. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm asked to remind you that you can ask questions in the chat, and we will answer them or address them as part of the Q&A discussion. I have so many questions, but I feel that I also want to stay fully engaged in the conversation, so it's difficult. But certainly this has been very rich, and I feel that there are so many insights to draw from our different participants. I would like to return specifically to the issue of financing, and particularly to one of our panelists whose organization looks beyond investments and really seeks to address specific strategic priorities. And I could see Myrto Vlasto, shaking her head as Lebogang was speaking, suggesting that she recognized some of the strategic priorities beyond the investment that needed to be taken into account, at the very least in the investment decisions. So good day to you, Myrto. Myrto is Debt Director for Africa at Incofin Investment Management. And Incofin has executed numerous funds in food and agriculture across Africa and globally with quite innovative investment strategies. So my question to you, Myrto, is in two parts. The first one is to do with, I'd like to know, what is the rationale that drives innovation at Incofin? And what are the main challenges to overcome from your perspective in rolling out these high-impact funds, particularly in Africa? And I'd also like to know, in pursuing these innovative strategies, how prominently does economic rate of return feature in your decisions as opposed to other strategic priorities? So in other words, I'd like to know how critical is demonstrating and achieving profitability for your ability to attract investors and for your ability to do the work that you do. Over to you, Myrto.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lisuba. And yes, I've been nodding probably throughout the conversation that has happened so far. I feel very honored to be part of this discussion. There have been a lot of enlightening remarks already made, and allow me to share a bit about the work that we do at Incofin. Hopefully that will be viewed as a contribution to the solution that we are all striving for. So at Incofin, Incofin, for those who are not familiar with us, we are an asset manager. We do impact investments for over 20 years now, in different geographies and in Africa in particular. We started supporting the sustainable agricultural value chains with a variety of instruments about a decade ago. Our aim was to facilitate access to markets for smallholder farmers. And so we have supported a variety of value chains going from cocoa to nuts and other commodities. And here I think I'd like to emphasize that most of the impact investors out there, when supporting agro value chains, they decide to expose themselves with cash crops. And that probably resonates with a previous contribution from Jason, I believe. However, in the recent years, I think as a sector, we've come to realize that it is essential to support value creation and value retention within the region. So typically, At Incofin, we are slowly withdrawing our support to those exporters who export raw material. And we support more and more initiatives that allow value creation locally, processing of the crops locally. So I think for us, it's a matter of supporting local job creation and value retention where the value was created at first. That's one thing. Another thing I wanted to mention is that on being innovative for us at Incofin, it's very much about being additional. So the idea is not to replace schemes that are already in place and that provide funding to local SMEs or cooperatives. The idea is to bring an additional proposition to the table through the features of our offer. So we are, for instance, in a position to offer long-term funding to some of our investees so that they can increase or improve their production capacity. We are in a position to offer funding with a very flexible mechanism when it comes to securities. And we also very much insist on the fact that we don't only provide funding solutions, but we also accompany our investees with substantial technical assistance in order to support them in building resilience that will serve their business way after our loan cycle will have ended. And talking about innovative initiatives, maybe there is one that stands out particularly for us. It's an initiative that we launched a year ago in close partnership with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN. Maybe some of you are familiar with this organization. And so we came to realize that about 80% of the calorie intake of the African communities across the region are produced by local SMEs. However, those SMEs often lack the opportunity to grow, the opportunity to be competitive, the opportunity to diversify their offer, and to serve their clients even better. We also realize that improving the nutrition of children and mothers is really the basis for a better future for an entire society. Well-nourished children have a better health, learn more, and eventually are able to contribute more in the society as adults. And so we took the bet to co-create a fund that supports sub-Saharan SMEs that produce nutritious food for the lower income population of the region. This, for many of our peers, is almost insane because, as we said earlier, the industry is traditionally much more comfortable in investing in SMEs that export their product to Western markets. And through that, the investment itself is largely de-risked, right? Because there is this triangulation mechanism between the lender, the borrower, and the buyer. Here with the initiative I wanted to talk about, it's totally different. It's from Africa to Africa. And, you know, it's up to us to deal with whatever risks that entails. So to implement this fund and make it viable, we adopted a blended approach, and that resonates with what Akif was mentioning earlier. So we fundraised quite successfully with a few institutional investors who were convinced about the relevance of this mandate and who supported our fund called Nutritious Food Financing Facility with a sizable amount of catalytic capital. The aim is that through this catalytic capital, we are in a position to further fundraise with the private sector. So essentially, we have created a layered capital structure for our fund that is in a position to address risk appetites of a variety of stakeholders, right? And when I say risk, I also imply return. And so with this fund, we have started supporting SMEs throughout the region. We have already deployed funds to 5 SMEs from Zambia to Senegal and from Rwanda to Kenya. And we aspire to deliver even more in the years to come, as this is an open-ended fund. So yes, for us, innovation is very much about addressing unmet needs and contributing to providing solutions that will make the region more prosperous on the longer term.
Thank you so much, Mirto. And listening to you, I heard many echoes of what Jason was saying. I really appreciate the very first thing you said about value creation and value retention. I think that sometimes, particularly if it's a sort of exporting type model or very outward looking model, and investors supporting these sorts of model, the triangulation you talked about, we lose focus or lose sight of the fact that this is necessarily a long-term endeavor, and you need to be invested in the place if you are going to actually have an impact beyond simply seeking return. But it's very encouraging to see that you are finding that actually not only are you able to appeal to those investors that look beyond the simple return, but you're also able to appeal to different, as you said, different risk and return appetites through your layered capitalization, and that's really fantastic. I may ask you a question later about that approach, that layer capitalization, and also for you to tell us a bit more about this fund, this nutrition fund that you created, and I believe you run that fund, because it's, these are the sorts of things we need, essentially. And we would like to see these sorts of investments be developed on the continent, and these funds be available more widely on the continent. But you're right, many people would be afraid to take those sorts of approaches. And so I think it's very important to highlight some of those successful and success stories, such as those of your fund, to convince people that actually it is possible and the impact is there. I also very much appreciated what you said about moving away from the export focus, moving back into local production, local processing and value addition, particularly considering that 80% of calorie intake comes from local SMEs, and that's vital because I think it was. I believe it was Lebogang mentioned this, and Jason too, this idea that today we essentially the majority, we're not addressing the needs of the African people with the current food systems that we have on the continent. And that necessarily needs to change if we are. So I very much appreciate the way that you're bridging the necessity for this sort of change with the financing and investment needs that are being addressed. And finally, the one takeaway that I think is also vital in what you were saying is this idea of seeking multiplier effects. You mentioned nutrition, particularly when it comes to feeding children and improving the nutrition of children. We know that there are significant multiplier effects, whether it be in terms of their productivity, their physiological development, their ability to learn, their energy levels in schools, and also if we're talking about homegrown school feeding systems, it's also a way of bringing in local production and creating an outlet for them. So, this is almost where I wanted you to go. This idea that when talking about investment in these contexts, we're not just talking about return, obviously. We are seeking to create value. We are seeking multiplier effects, so please, I will ask you a question in 1 minute to develop a bit more on that, because I feel that you are bringing an important solution to this question. But right before I do, I'd like to quickly go back to Akif, because Akif, you are also your organization, as we said, is a network of organizations involved in blended finance, and you, on your website, you essentially say that Convergence envisions a world where blended finance makes SDGs investable in emerging markets and developing economies. So I'd like to ask you, because I feel that is a sort of common theme, and that's very much what Mirta was talking about. I'd like to ask you, what does making SDGs investable actually entail from your perspective? And what are some of the innovations that you are seeing in the ways that the blended financing arrangements that you and your network are working on are being structured in order to make SDGs investable?
Great, thanks for that question. So ideally, in an ideal world, markets should be functioning efficiently, and all of the capital that we're looking to mobilize in the agriculture space in the context of Africa should be flowing without any specific intervention from de-risking or return enhancement, ideally from domestic local capital. Of course, as you all know, that's not the case, which is why we're having this particular discussion. So essentially what we're trying to do at Convergence is to really advance this concept of blended finance. How do we bring more concessional capital to the table? Mirtho spoke about very eloquently about the nutritious food financing facility. And it's a blended fund, but it would not have been possible without some de-risking capital, some concessional capital in that structure, mobilizing those institutional investors that Mirtho mentioned. And let's also be very clear, when we talk about, we want to mobilize the private sector. We've got institutional capital, you've got family office capital, you've got impact investors, and we can go on, but all of these kinds of investors have different risk appetites, different checkbooks in terms of the sizes. So the kinds of interventions we have to structure are a function of who we are looking to mobilize. And I'd love to hear more about Mirtho and how she managed to mobilize those institutional investors. Now, I also saw, as I mentioned, the idea is using concessional capital to bring in private capital that's sitting on the sidelines. Now, concessional capital is stretched in the OECD world. Oshani made a point in the chat box around how do we get the petrostates to pay for some of this. Now, you've got the Qatar Fund for Development, the Saudi Fund for Development. The Emiratis are quite active across the continent. How do we get these organizations or institutions or countries that have large pools of capital into these conversations to get them to understand what blended finance is all about, to educate them, and to also get them to support the development context here in Africa? We've got 54 votes on this continent. We need to use those 54 votes at the UN to get these actors off the sidelines and to get them more involved, because typically you're going to see the Swiss and the Belgians and the Americans and the Brits and the Canadians who are doing all of this de-risking. We need to bring some of these actors as well off the sidelines and into these conversations. So that's essentially, who we are and what we stand for. We really stand for how do we get these conversations to the concessional capital providers, increase their ability as well to make these interventions. I also want to mention, the domestic resource capacity here in Africa. We've got numerous development banks on the continent. I'm sitting here in Kigali. We have the Development Bank of Rwanda. Across the border, you have the Uganda Development Bank. In Tanzania, you have the Tanzania Agricultural Development Bank. You also have regional development banks, DBSA, TADB, BOAD in West Africa. These organizations have the ability to originate and arrange transactions because they are close to the ground. Also, the perception of risk and the reality of risk of these organizations is much more narrower than a foreign investor. So how do we get the likes of FMO, British International Invest, IFC, KFW, all of these investors who typically tend to be the ones investing in Africa? How do we get them to partner with these organizations to actually mobilize more local capital and to de-risk more transactions and to get transactions and financing flowing to the various SMEs that we have all talked about? So that's essentially who we are, what we stand for, what we're looking to do. We do that in a variety of ways, and it's great to see in COFIN as well. We one of our members doing some great work on the continent. But happy to sort of answer any questions. But hopefully that's given you a flavor of what does it mean to make the SDG investable. It's about how do we get all these actors to work in concert? How do we share best practices? How do we build capacity? And also, we have a grant program. We provide grants to early stage innovative transactions that we think have the ability to go on and scale. So Aseli Africa is a grantee of ours. We gave them a grant when they were a concept on a piece of paper saying, okay, you know what? Instead of Canada and Denmark and so on going deal by deal, let's give them some concessional money and let them go and use the partnerships that they have with banks to mobilize that capital. So that's what we're trying to do. And it's great to see that we're having this conversation and blended finance has come up a few times.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Akif. And that really, you've really summarized essentially what the challenge is with respects to mobilizing the sort of financing that and investments that are needed in this space. I'm curious because you mentioned the fact that there is a lot of money on the sidelines, and part of the challenge is trying to get it off the sidelines, essentially. What are some of the reasons that you are hearing that is preventing a lot of that capital, or a lot of these actors you mentioned, from preventing them from being more willing to be involved? I mean, we have these global forums, these conversations are not new. So what do you think is stopping them from being more active and more proactive in seeking these sorts of investments?
Let's take domestic African actors, right? If you look at the total amount of asset under management and domestic institutional capital here on the continent, that means Sanlam, that means the Rwanda Social Security Board and others. It's around $1 trillion. Roughly, we've heard the SDG financing gap for the food space in Africa is 180. You mentioned 93 to 512, but in Africa, it's 180 roughly. If we can get even a small amount into this space, we can make a big difference. If you go to all the pension investors and you ask them, if you actually look at what are the assets that they're actually investing in, it's primarily government securities and real estate. Everything that we're talking about, if Mirtho went to them and said, hey, you know what, I got the nutritious food financing facility, do you want to write a ticket to this? They'd be like, this is alternative strategy. This is not something that they're used to. This is not something that they understand. This is not something that they know. And they themselves have a high degree of risk aversion. But ultimately, who owns them? The governments own them, right? The governments and the ministries of finance own these pension funds, own some of these insurance companies within the context and boundaries in which they operate. So it's up to these governments to really say, you know what, have these hard discussions. We need you to finance infrastructure. We need you to finance the real economy, and you're not doing enough of that. We need you to support the local development banks to do more. As I mentioned, deal sizes, FX, and they themselves look at their own country and say, my God, there's a lot of political risk here. I want to buy US Treasuries as an example. A lot of them sit and buy US Treasuries all day, in essence and in theory risk-free. So there has to be really a conversation shift that has to happen and says, you guys have this mandate. You should be investing in the real economy in your countries, but you're not doing this. And the ministries of finance and the central banks need to have this conversation and need to also change the way they regulate some of these pension funds and insurance companies, because that's an important question. When I'm talking to pension funds and insurance companies, let's say in the global north, they'll tell me, sure, Africa is great. It's an exciting opportunity. I can't invest in countries that I don't have an investment grade rating. That is my mandate. Who has an investment grade rating in Africa? Mauritius and Botswana, and sometimes Morocco. South Africa even doesn't have an investment grade rating. Kenya doesn't have. So I need to create investment opportunities that have that rating, that are potentially, in theory, investable. And we can do that through blended finance, diversification, credit enhancement, subordination, all of these different tricks and these different technologies and these different tools, shouldn't say tricks, but all of these different tools and these technologies can essentially get these transactions to the point of being credit-worthy, such that these large institutional actors sitting in Europe, in Canada, and Australia can invest in African SMEs, can invest in African infrastructure, so that we can plug this funding gap. So that it exists, we just need to create those assets.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Akif. You know, it's interesting you say that, because I was reading an article recently about the debt for nature swap that Gabon entered in. And the article was remarking that actually the rating of the swap mechanism was higher than that of the country. So that is also a way in which some of these arrangements can overcome some of those challenges. But yes, $1 trillion in assets under management. I wonder how much of that is reinvested on the continent, or is, yeah. So I think those are some great insights. Thank you so much, Akif. I'm being told that we are running short on time, so I will swiftly move on to, last but not least, Jerry Ntare. Jerry Ntare is the acting CEO of Agrifood, the sovereign wealth fund for the Republic of Rwanda. And so I think this is one of the actors that I believe has interiorized much of what Akif was saying, and is trying to do something about it. Agrifood is a trailblazer, growing from $16 million in assets in 2014 to over $300 million worth of assets today, and aiming to reach $1 billion in assets under management by 2030. So very ambitious and exponential growth. So Jerry, we know that you're partnering with donors and foreign investors and DFIs to invest in food processing ventures. One such venture is Africa Improved Foods, in which Agrifood co-invested alongside a range of partners to source maize from local farmers and process them into fortified foods for pregnant women and infants. So I really see in that specific initiative, I see echoes of everything that Myrto was saying in terms of what types of investments should be pursued. And this is being done by a local actor. So I think, Jerry, you're making everybody happy with this initiative and with this approach. So Jerry, could you tell us what were the key conditions that made this possible? And how are you continuing to co-invest with donors, addressing all the challenges that have been raised by previous speakers in similar ventures? What are the conditions, and how are you pursuing this work that you do?
Yeah, thank you very much. I thank everyone who has been involved in preparing this. As you mentioned, so we are the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Rwanda, and basically we are working toward like being the investor arm of the government in different sectors. So we have different companies, different sectors, and agribusiness being the second largest under our portfolio. So we're working with Africa Improved Food, and this came out of the needs that was in the country, especially for pregnant women and infants. So the idea came from the top, and I think I'll be more or less like relating to what everyone has been saying in terms of political will, in terms of having policies that are helping these initiatives to be on board. So it started on top, and they looked at which vehicle that we need to put in place that will assist the other investors to put this in place and help them throughout to make sure that it's successful. So that's how we came in, and we co-invested with others, and we invested in a 45,000 metric ton factory just to initially help pregnant women and infants. If you look at the impact that this is bringing to the country, it's really huge, because they're providing agriculture extension support to the farmers. If you look at for just an example to the local farmers, since Africa Improved Food came in place, the production of maize, like we used to have this aflatoxin up to 97% into the maize. But today, through this extension support services to the farmers, this has reduced to 3% of aflatoxin, which means that like everything that they're producing is taken by the factory. So this is more or less like improving the lives of the farmers, make sure that they feel themselves like supported to sell their produce to Africa Improved Food. But again, on the other side, Africa Improved Food also provided the products that are needed for the specific type of individual that we're looking at. But looking at now the impact toward other people. So today, like the government is buying, and the World Food Program is buying most of the produce, but again, channeled to the population. Now they're looking at how do we diversify and make sure that even other people are getting these products through the shelves into different supermarkets and everywhere. So for us, what we do is we more or less like to support whatever initiative is coming, and also advocate to the policymakers to make sure that the policies that are there are flexible enough to make sure that they're supporting the initiatives of the company. This is one, but we now coming to different companies. We are partnering with OCP in Rwanda Fertilizer Company. This is 100 metric tons production facility of blended fertilizers that has started production in January this year. This is also something that came because we were importing all the fertilizers, and they were not even they were just importing, make sure that to check and see if this will work. But today, with Rwanda Fertilizer Company, what you're doing is they started by soil mapping, soil testing, and make sure that they do customized fertilizer for different type of soils. So this initiatives also is a huge one, because it brings a different type of initiative to what people were used to do. Like they will come to your farm and then have a demo plot where they will farm and apply the fertilizer, and you see by yourselves what is coming out, and then you also use it, and they have these services that they go through the whole process for, let's say, 1, 2, 3 seasons with the farmers, make sure that they know exactly what to use, when to use it, and like the timing. So again, it's more of how do we interact with the investors, also the side of the government. Now, on this particular one, we used to have a policy saying that any formula of fertilizers that comes out, it needs to be tested for 2 seasons to make sure that they are approved and people can use it. But this was done before we have like a facility in the country. Now what you're doing is we're trying to change this policy to make sure that it's shorter enough, because they can test it through the farm, the model farm that they've done it. This can only take 1 season, and the formula is approved and can be used for the next season. So these are exchanges that we do just to facilitate. Jason talked about how do we create an environment that like investors feels comfortable and feels that they can come in and invest. These are kind of initiatives that we come in as a sovereign wealth fund, but again, interacting with the government and the investor, and it pays to a great extent. I'll also just bring in part of our strategy. So as a sovereign wealth fund, we've just approved our strategy for the coming next 5 years. And the focus is more or less on food and agri. This is where we see opportunities. And it's not that like, yes, we are coming with impact, but again, there is a return into this. Looking at what is there, like the losses that we have along the value chain of the food, it's really, I don't know how I can say it. It's if you're saying like you're having 40% losses of food through the value chain from the farmers to the plate. So how do we tackle in as the sovereign wealth fund to make sure that we reduce this food waste to the minimum possible? So we partnering with USAID into this. So we're going through a study to make sure what are the opportunities into these value chains, and make sure that we tap into this. For instance, we have warehouses that the government have invested in for some times back. But these warehouses, they need some adjustment, they need some improvement, they need, a lot of things. But today, the government is not ready to do that. But as a sovereign wealth fund, we feel like this is an opportunity that we can tap in, coming along with other investors. And like we're trying to look at a collaborative mode of funding this. If you are bringing this investment, the investor that will come will maybe match up for $1 that we are bringing in as a facility or infrastructure that we have, and then another $1 will come from the investor to make sure that we upgrade, we bring the cold chain, so that at least we reduce this waste that we're having. So our initiatives coming like from next year, going 5 years, five years to come, will be more or less like food and agri. Make sure that we exhaust all the opportunities that are there, interest investors, and we have investors that are willing to partner with us. You look at different countries and different perspectives. Like there are investors who feel like, to go in this country, I need an anchor investor. I need someone who's in that country that will be, I'll invest along and then try to see where I'm stuck. Then the other investor can sort of coming up with ideas and then exchange and see how we can do that. So in Rwanda, we more or less like into that angle, and we're working with Rwanda Development Board to make sure that every investor who is interested in coming and investing in Rwanda, so we there like to be partner to bring finance, and then they'll bring also different expertise, finance, and then we go along with it. This comes to like we in all sectors, we in rice, in tea. Now we have a factory that is doing cassava flour. So we're working with also USAID to make sure that we now creating a line to make this cassava flour fortified. So this is also an initiative that will match up what Africa Improved Food is doing and go in the same way to different people. So we're not that big in terms of asset under management or actual capital that we can invest right now, but we are able to attract investors who we can co-invest with in some projects that are viable and have a lot of impact to our people. I think I can stop from there, and then any question I will be able to respond. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jerry, for explaining, how you're approaching these questions. And indeed, in what you were saying, I was seeing very much in terms of the conditions, seeing very much how you take a position which may not necessarily be taken by traditional investors, but you essentially fill the gap. So you take that, you make the step for the more traditional investors to get involved. And you do so also with a mindset that doesn't hesitate to sort of expand to connected or supporting activities in order to you know, when you were talking, for instance, about the soil testing and different, from what I heard, investing in services, in businesses and the likes that are going to be able to then, you know, create coherence between your investments. I think that's vital, and I very much appreciate those insights. Now, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, I know that time is running short, so I will try to essentially bring this meeting slowly to a close. There is a question that I would like to ask all of you. The question was initially meant for Jerry, but I feel that it's a question that we can all ask. So, from your experience in the space, whether it be Akif, Myrto, Lebogang, Jerry, unfortunately, Jason had to leave us due to another engagement. But in a few words, from your experience in the space and in the face of the magnitude of the challenges we face, what are lessons? What is the one lesson that you would want countries to draw or other organizations to draw from your work in order to help us address these challenges moving forward? So what is one thing that you really feel people need to bear in mind in order for us to address this challenge, in order for them to contribute to how we address the many challenges we've discussed today? So let us begin maybe with Myrto.
Thank you very much. Well, for us, I think, and reflecting on the journey so far with the Nutritious Food Financing Facility. So, as mentioned earlier, we launched this fund a year ago exactly. What we have come to realize is that as we try to onboard impactful SMEs and support them with funding and technical assistance so that they can contribute even more to bringing nutritious food to the table of the local communities, we realize that there is often a lack of understanding on the topic of FX risk. So very often the companies that we approach quickly jump to the conclusion that a single-digit interest rate in US dollars is a cheaper option than a double-digit interest rate in local currency. And for us, it has somehow caught us by surprise, the amount of sensitization and awareness work that we need to do in order to make sure that by investing into these companies, we do it in a responsible manner and we don't expose them to additional risk. So I think we are trying to be as creative as we can in finding ways to mitigate those risks for the companies that we want to support. But I think this is definitely a topic on which we would want to find even more solutions locally through local banks, for instance, who are in a position to provide services to hedge exposures to local currencies for the SMEs I'm talking about. So this is, I think, a space in which there is more that should be done by all parties involved in order for us to be able to deliver what we aim to deliver sustainably and responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Myrto. Akif, would you like to go next? What is one insight that you'd like to share with the participation with the audience today?
Sure. So my one insight is, look, different products, different transactions, all of them have a range of different risks. We need to be clear about what specific risk are we looking to get off the table, and that will inform the design of that particular intervention. So what specific risk, who am I looking to mobilize? And the last call to action that I have is, we can have a multitude of these conversations. Ultimately, at the end of the day, on the continent of Africa, good governance trumps all. That is what we need on this continent. Nothing can replace good governance. Look at what's happening in Mozambique. Look at what's happening in Sudan. We can do all the de-risking in the world, but we will not mobilize capital to Sudan and Mozambique until we have good governance, stable regulatory environment, predictable regulatory environment. That's the most important thing, and we need to keep that in mind.
Thank you so much, Akif. This is music to my ears as a policymaker. Good governance is key, and no amount of de-risking will trump that, or will avoid the need for that. Lebogang, please give us an answer, and I'm so sorry, but we will have to ask that you stick to 1 or 2 minutes because we are really running short of time. Thank you.
For me, it's two things: innovation and placing the people most affected at the center, whether it's innovation in partnering people, innovation in financing, innovation in investment, innovation in partnerships. We need to think outside of the box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lebogang. Very clear and pertinent points. Jerry, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think one thing that we feel like we can do right now is opportunities are there. How policies in different countries support those opportunities to attract capital in the country. I think that's the most part. Like whoever is fearing entering into a venture in a country, it's perhaps like there's no security or policies are not favorable. Those are two key things that I feel like we need to make sure they are there, and then people will come, like initiatives, people will come with ideas, and then like if those two are supportive, and then it will have an impact.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this will be our conclusion, and it has been an incredibly insightful conversation, which will be unfortunately too short, or we don't have enough time to give a conclusion to it justice. But you can be sure that much of what has been discussed today will be further treated in a briefing paper. So we'll write a lot of this down, write a lot of these insights down, because these are important contributions that we hope to take to Kampala in January 2025 for the CADEP 3 meeting. Having said that, I want to give warm thank you to all the panelists for their incredibly rich conversations. A warm thank you to the audience that has graced us with their presence and attention today. And thank you to the organizers for putting together this very enriching conversation. So much more to say, but I think right now, one thing is clear: the opportunities are there. Actors are working on the ground. We need to be very specific about what we're trying to address. We need to remember that good governance is key. We need to keep people at the center, and we need to look long-term and really invest in the communities beyond the simple investments that we're trying to make. So with that, I want to thank you. The next webinar in the Road to Kampala series will be taking place on the 11th of December and focusing on how to empower small-scale farmers and SMEs in Africa. So we look forward to seeing you there. The link to register is now in the chat, so please click on that link to register. For now, I will say thank you once more to everybody and wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.